I see you. Hey, Steve Bentley from Vancouver. Doug Winters from Red Barn Corner, Altamont, Illinois. Lisa Gruel Brown from Wisconsin. I remember La Crosse, is that right? La Crosse? Somewhere up there. John Pickett, how you doing, buddy? They say there was a secret chord that David played and that pleased the Lord, but you don't really go for music, do you? It goes like this: the fourth, the fifth, the minor fall, the major lift, the baffled king composing hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Well, your faith was strong, but you needed proof. You saw her bathing on the roof, beauty in the moonlight overthrew you. She tied you to her kitchen chair, she crushed your throne and cut your hair, and from your lips she drew the hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Well, those are the first two verses of Hallelujah by Leonard Cohen. That's going to come to play a part in this story I'm going to tell today. When I say I'm telling you a story, it's not a made-up story. It's a real story. It's a thing that actually happened. And for many years, I lived in my pickup truck. I had a cap top on it, and I built a bed into the back. And under the bed, there was room for my guitar and my bags. And then on the one side, I would put my sound system, and on the other side, I put a bed. And I lived in that truck more or less for about 7 or 8 years, I guess. And while I toured and played music all over the country, I always had a P.O. box in Austin, P.O. Box 4022. I don't know who has it now, but it's not me. Hey, Susie, how you doing? Hey, Brad Field. Did you jam with Flight of the Conchords? No, I did not. They're from New Zealand. For those who don't know the joke there, no, those guys were probably still in grade school at this time. Lisa grew from Burlington, Wisconsin. Got the answer to the question. Anyway, so frequently I would go on long trips, and by trips I just mean just sort of living in my truck. I had found a concert promoter in New Zealand who liked my music, and she brought me to New Zealand to do a 3-week tour. It was really like 2.5 weeks. It was like 3 weekends and the weeks between. So it was about 18 days, I think, that I was there. And I stayed a couple of days after, so it was more like 21 days. But that's actually the story that I'm going to tell, is about the days after the tour completed. I'm sorry, I'm reading the comments as they come in here. I was headed over. I drove my truck from Austin, Texas, over to Los Angeles, California, and I had a friend who lived in Van Nuys there. His name is Mark Humphreys, and Mark and his wife Melissa let me park my truck at their house, and while I went to New Zealand, so I flew out and I spent 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks touring and playing music. I had rented a car, and for those of you who have never been to New Zealand, it's one of the most beautiful places on the planet. It's full of mountains, many of which are green, but many of which, especially on the South Island, are covered in snow and ice and glaciers. And it was a beautiful, beautiful place to be. If you've ever watched the Lord of the Rings, any of the movies of the Lord of the Rings, that was filmed in New Zealand. And so anyway, so I did my tour, and it took me all over the North Island. Then I went down to the South Island. I took a ferry with my rental car through the Marlborough Sound, which is one of the most beautiful ferry rides I've ever been on. And then I toured around the South Island and ended up The last gig on the tour was in a city, a southern city in New Zealand called Oamaru. And for those of you who don't know the geography of New Zealand, a large portion of the population lives in Auckland and in the North Island, Hamilton, and the capital escaping me at the moment. Anyway, so Oamaru is one of the southernmost cities. There's one city called Dunedin, which is the southernmost city in New Zealand, and the biggest city is Christchurch on the South Island. It's sort of the capital of the South Island. It's on the Pacific coast. If you don't know the geography, Australia is down there below Indonesia, and then just southeast of Australia are the two main islands that comprise New Zealand. I learned something recently. I'm just going to say this just as sort of an additional data point, that New Zealand was not occupied by the human species until 1200 AD. So it was 800 and some years ago. And it's one of the most recent places to be inhabited by humans. And when the humans got there, there were no animals on the island. I mean, the only animals on the island were birds. And mostly were large flightless ground birds. Moa was the biggest; it was 13 feet tall, and they quickly were eradicated after humans arrived. But I got to see a skeleton of one at Wellington. That's the capital. I got to see a what do you call it? A skeleton model of a moa bird, and they're like gigantic ostriches, kind of things. Anyway, so I was in Oamaru for my last gig. It was a place there called the Penguin Room, and I have a photograph, I think, of that. And I don't have it. I lie. Oh, here it is. Is this the Penguin Room? Anyway, the venue that I played, the Penguin Entertainers Club, and there's a photograph for you. So you can see what that kind of looks like, a big concrete block building or a rock building or something. Stone building, maybe is the right word. And I actually got to see some penguins right before the gig. They took me down to the beach there, and there were some blue penguins, and they were really interesting to see. And I had a gig, like the rest of the gigs. It was just me telling stories and singing songs. And about halfway through the show, we took a break, and there was a woman who came up to me, and she was very interesting looking, and she was one of the younger people in the crowd, probably in her early 30s or so. I think her name was Julie, and I can't remember for sure, but I'm pretty sure her name was Julie. And she had a funny hat on. I remember that about her. And she told me that she just loved my set, and she really loved my song Chloe and Katie, and she wanted to tell me that. And she said, "I know that you're going to lunch tomorrow with Clarky, and I'm going to join you at lunch, and I have something I want to give you." And so, I didn't know what to make of that exactly, but Clarky was my host, and he and his wife, I think they were running the Penguin Club at the time, or certainly were managing the promotions and that sort of thing. And I was staying at their house, and they invited me to go to lunch the next day. And as we were up late that night and having, I think, maybe sharing a sip of whiskey or something before bed, and Clarky asked me if I knew the song "No More Waltzing Matilda," which is a great song written, I think, by a Scottish guy, and his name escapes me at the moment. And I told him I had heard the song. It was very much an anti-war song about a guy who fought in the Battle of Gallipoli in Turkey during World War I, where New Zealand and Australian forces were decimated, and I think British also. Anyway, so he wanted me to learn that song, and I thought, okay, I'd do that. So the next morning, I woke up and he was gone, and his wife was gone, and they had left me. They had left me an album, like an actual physical vinyl album of that album. It had that song on it. And then, but they also left me Eric Bogle. Thank you very much, Steve Bentley. You're the winner. Eric Bogle wrote the song "No More Waltzing Matilda." So they left me the Eric Bogle record, and they also left me a cassette tape in order to record the song. So I made a cassette recording of it, and then I started flipping through the rest of his albums because I thought there's no point in just having one song on the cassette, right? So I'm going through and I'm finding all these great records and some Simon and Garfunkel and things I really liked. And among them was a Jeff Buckley record, and it had the song "Hallelujah" on it. And so I put that on there, and I had heard that song on KUT. John Ailey used to play that song frequently. It was one of his favorite songs. And famously, when Jeff Buckley died, John Ailey played that song for an hour straight. He just played it on loop for about an hour down in Austin. But I had only heard it sort of in passing. I liked it. And then when I saw it, I thought, oh, I want to check this song out again. So now I'm driving. Actually, don't get ahead of myself. So then I go to lunch with Meek Clarkey and his wife, whose name I can't recall. It's been 19 years ago. So anyway, I get over there, and here's a picture of me. I'm riding a bicycle. It's one of those old kind of bicycles that has the huge front wheel and a little tiny back wheel. It's a penny something. I can't remember. Maybe Steve Bentley can tell me what kind of bike that is. But anyway, it was one of those things, you know. I was a performer, and they invited some guests, and we had lunch. One of the guests was the young woman who had approached me at the gig the night before. Her name, again, I think was Julie. And she was a member of the Brown Owls, which was some kind of a group that they had. And they had all these rules, but they were just silly. It was a silly thing. And so she gave me some things about the Brown Owls, and I could join the Brown Owls if I did a certain pledge or something. But it was kind of a goofy thing, and she was very good natured about it. But she also had a 30 or 40-year-old bottle of scotch, and she gave it to me, and she said, "I have a favor to ask." And I said, "Okay, what is it?" And she said, "Well, one of my friends in Christchurch, which is I'm thinking about a 3 or 4 hour drive north of Oamaru. She said, my friend has a father who is sort of a hermit, and he lives right on your drive. He lives just north of Christchurch, about 40 or 50 miles. And you could, if you could just stop along the way and give this bottle to him as a gift from me, I would appreciate it." And she said, "He's a hermit. He doesn't get mail or anything. He doesn't have, I can send it to his daughter, but since you're going, would you mind just dropping it off?" And I said, "Sure." And she said that the guy had an interesting story, that I should like to meet him and get to know him. And he was somewhat older than me, maybe 10 or 15 years older than me. And he had been in Vietnam in the war, and had come back as a heroin addict. And when he, anyway, I'll tell the rest of the story, because I don't think that she told me the whole story. She just told me a few details about it. But she did tell me that he liked the kind of music that I played, and that he would like my music, and that I would like his music. And he also played guitar and wrote songs, and he loved Townes Van Zandt and Guy Clark and all those guys that I like too. So she asked me if I'd bring that bottle, and I said I would. And she described to me how to find him, which was my first question. If he's a hermit, how am I going to find him? But it turned out it wasn't that difficult. So I took the car. I went past Christchurch and certain number of kilometers or something past Christchurch. I also, by the way, it's a beautiful drive, because the mountains are on your left to the west, and the Pacific Ocean was on my right, almost the entire drive. And I got to see whales and sea lions and all kinds of beautiful wildlife, dolphins and porpoises and things. I stopped. I took a whole bunch of pictures, and you can't make nothing out in the pictures, but they were beautiful. So anyway, I go to this certain distance past the last Christchurch exit, and then I see this. I'm supposed to be looking on my left for a little sea shack where they sell food, like fresh from the ocean. And so then you turn around there and go back like a half mile or something along those lines, and there's a little post there, and you can park right by this post. Well, that was right next to where his cabin was. Uh, so I get out and I'm a little nervous because this guy didn't know I was coming, and he's a hermit. And so maybe he didn't want any visitors, but I didn't know. And so I took the bottle and I walked up there. It was just about 150 yards or so up the side of the mountain. And I kind of circled around this cabin. And as I got all the way around it, I ran into there's a guy standing in front, or sort of squatting in front of a fire. And he had water sort of on the boil, and he had a pan, and he was cutting up onions, and there was rice in the pan as well. And he was cutting up onions, and he was making himself dinner. And so he just looked up at me and didn't say anything. And I said, "Hi, are you Peter?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "My name is Bill, and I was sent here by someone who you know named Julie from Omaru, and she asked me to bring you this bottle of scotch." I said, "I don't know much about it." I said, "But she told me that you would appreciate it." And he kind of smiled, and he said, "Oh yeah, I love it, scotch." And so I walked over and I gave it to him, and he went back to cutting his vegetables, and then he stopped, and he said, "So what are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I've been touring, playing music. I'm a folk singer from the States, and my tour is over, and so I'm just headed back up to the North Island to go to a festival before I head back on Easter Sunday." And so he said, "What kind of music do you play?" And so I told him, and I said, "I'm in the songwriter world of John Prine and Townes Van Zandt and those kind of people." And his eyes lit it right up, and so we sort of talked about music a little bit. So on the way up, I was listening to that cassette tape, and I had listened to that song "No More Waltzing Matilda" a few times, and then I let the cassette tape play, and eventually it came to the song "Hallelujah." Right, so I listened to that song, and I was like, "That is about the most beautiful song I've ever heard." So I rewound it, and I probably played it. I don't know. I pulled a John Ailey. I probably played it 4 or 5 times straight as I was driving up, and I just was thinking about the song, the beauty of it. And so it was on my mind when I was talking to him, and I said, "Have you ever heard that song? Are you familiar with that song, Hallelujah?" And he looked up at me, and he stopped doing what he was doing, and he said, "They say there was a secret chord that David played and that pleased the Lord, but you don't really go for music, do you?" Well, then he recited the entire song, and 7 verses. I mean, not just the 4 or 5 that Jeff Buckley did or Leonard Cohen recorded, but verses I'd never heard before. And anyway, he got done doing that, and I was like, "Wow!" I said, "That's interesting that you know that whole song." And he said, "Yeah." He said he had learned it years and years ago, and before Jeff Buckley had recorded it. In fact, I don't know that he had even heard Jeff Buckley's recording of it. But anyway, so we started talking, and he told me this story. We talked about. He said, "You want to have some of the scotch?" And I said, "I'd love to." And he said, "Well, I would like to too, but," he said, I probably should finish making dinner first. I haven't eaten anything today." And he said, so let's wait till we get some dinner, and then we can open up the scotch." So I said, "That's fine." And he so he starts telling me this story about he had come home from the war in Vietnam, and he was addicted to heroin and was in a bad shape. And I should say that this is how I recall it, and many people have heard me tell this story, and I don't recall exactly what I heard from Peter and what I learned from Julie and Dave and Clarky about it, but this is the best of my recollection. And so he told me he was addicted to heroin when he got back, and he was in a bad way, and so he decided that he was going to go back to Asia because he wanted to go back where the poppies were, and so he went back, and he went to into the Steve Bentley, one of the big mountains there, where Mount Everest is. And he's going up into the highlands, up into the mountains, and trying to find access to like the real deal heroin stuff. And I don't know if I can't remember if he was going to try to traffic it or if he was just going back there to be a heroin addict in the Himalayas or what it was. But anyway, he ended up at a Buddhist monastery, and he was hungry and he hadn't slept in some time, and so he stopped there and asked if he could stay, just for the night and rest up and maybe get a bite to eat. And they turned him away. They said, "No, you can't come in here because you're a heroin addict, and we don't." I mean, I'm not sure how they knew that. Maybe just by the look of him, but they said that he was not welcome there, and so he kind of insisted that he really needed to stop and rest and could he at least get something to eat. Well, anyway, one thing led to another, and they agreed to let him stay, but they said that if he came to stay, that he had to stay until he got clean, and then he could leave if he wanted to. So he stayed for a few weeks and got clean, and they took care of him and fed him. And so as time passed, he started studying Buddhism, and the excuse me. He eventually sort of entered into a formal program of studying Buddhism there at the monastery, and they told him that they would let him do this two-year program, and at the end of that, if he completed it, then he would repay them by spending some period of time as a Buddhist monk in a community, in one of the local communities. So he agreed, and he did it, and he stayed, and he finished this course. I don't think it was like a formal course, but it was like a particular period of time, kind of an apprenticeship, but just learning about Buddhism, and this monastic study, And so he did that, and then he went to the community, and he fulfilled that obligation, and then, and this must have been in his sort of early 30s, he moved back to New Zealand. And now he was clean, and he didn't know what he was going to do. So he went back to a place where his family used to vacation. He grew up on the North Island, but we're on the South Island here. And they used to come down, and there was a beach just down the hill, across the road. There was a beach, and on that beach there was they used to go to on vacation, and on that beach there was a cave, and so he stayed in the cave for about 3 or 4 weeks, and then he started exploring. He was exploring the hillside, and didn't know what he was going to do with himself, and he just built himself a little hut there, and that was the hut that I was at. And so he basically had been squatting on that property for something like 20 years at that time. And so it was a Catholic nature preserve, and they eventually discovered that he was there, but they decided that since he was sort of taking care of things, he was germinating pear trees and doing things to sort of improve the land in ways that weren't going to wreck the nature preserve. And I guess they just sort of accepted him as one of the inhabitants of the nature preserve. And so he stayed there, and he had permission, and he collected a welfare check from the government of New Zealand. I think maybe because I don't know all the ins and outs of that, but maybe partly because of his military service, he was entitled to some kind of benefit. But he socked away most of that money. He lived on rice. He says he lived on rice and just grass, things that he could just pull out of the ground there. And most of the year he was able to just survive by foraging. He had pears. He made his own mead, and he had honeybees, and made his own mead with the honey. He showed me the honey, and the mead that he had prepared the fall before. It wasn't ready to drink yet, but anyway, so he basically was just a hermit living there, and he had a daughter from before he had or I'm not sure exactly when she was born, but it was obviously from before the time he went back to Asia, because she was in her 30s, I think, by the time I got there. And she lived in Christchurch. And so, he had very little interaction with the outside world, except that he'd go to town once in a while just to buy spices and things that he really needed, or she would bring them to him. Anyway, over time, he's about 10 or 12 years, he saved up his monthly check, and he had enough money to go. He wanted to go to Europe. He had never been to Europe, and he wanted to go. And so he took a flight, and he landed in Dublin, where his family had originated, and before they came to New Zealand. And so he spent a couple of days in Dublin, and he was in a pub, and there was a ceilidh going on, and they were just all taking turns singing songs. And there was this beautiful young woman in her mid-20s, or early 20s or mid-20s, and I don't even know what her name was, but she was a fiddle player, and he was really taken with her, and he really wanted to sort of impress her. So when it came his time to sing a song, he sang the song Hallelujah, and well, it worked, and she was impressed, and they hooked up. So he had 3 weeks to travel around Europe. And so she decided to go along. And so they traveled around Europe together, and had a wonderful time. They fell in love. And then it was time for him to return. So he flew home, and they exchanged letters but via his daughter for some period of time. And again, all the details are not as fresh as they could be, since it's been 19, like I said, 19 years or 18. And so some 9 months or 10 months went by, and she arrived. She came to New Zealand to come and visit him. And she stayed with him, and they were still in love, and they decided that, he was so excited to have someone in his life, because, even though he didn't choose really to be a hermit, he was just living like a monastic monk. And so that was just how his life was. It wasn't that he didn't want to have a partner, but his lifestyle didn't lead to meeting women. But this was a fluke, I guess, that he had met her. And so he was extremely happy, and she decided to stay. When she came to New Zealand, she was just planning to visit him, and he convinced her to stay. And eventually he proposed to her and asked her to marry him. And so she took a job at that sea shack that I mentioned. There's actually a name for it, like clam shack or something. I can't remember exactly what they called it, but there was this clam shack that I had mentioned. It was like the marker for me to turn around and find this place. Well, that was where she worked, and it was just a walk. If you walk through the woods, you could get there in about 5 minutes walk across the mountains. And so every morning, she at about sunup, she would go down there to the shack, and she would work and make, take the fresh seafood and boil it and spice it, and then sell it to cars on the highway. And she did this for some number of months, and they were preparing to be married. And one day they were surprised because it was right before the wedding, like the week before the wedding, and she, the daughter of Peter and several of their friends came up to have like a bachelorette party for her and for him. I mean, just a party celebrating the nuptials. And so they were up late, and according to Peter, they were up, until 4 or 5 in the morning, having a great time. And then sunup came at 6:30 or something, and she had to go to work. So she, still in the party mode, I suppose, went down to the shack, and there was a house behind the shack, and then there was a railroad track, and then right in front of the railroad track was this shack that they sold the seafood out of, and then there's the highway, beach, sea. So she's in the shack, and she realizes she's starting to make the food, and she realizes that they're out of one of the spices that she needed for for preparing the food. And so she hustles out of the back of the shack to go to the garage of this house, and she gets hit by a train and killed. And so when I'm going to back up just a second. When I had gotten there, he told me that I couldn't leave my car, or my car parked where it was. He had taken me back to the shack, and he showed me a stump, and it was a laminated photograph on the top of the stump. And it was turns out, he explained later, that was her. And so she had been killed. And it was probably the most tragic true story I've ever heard. And I was in tears, listening to the story. I was in tears. And then I started reflecting on this song, Hallelujah, and how, how profoundly important that song was to him. But it became important to me because the song is not a song of joy and celebration. It's a song of acceptance, and maybe in that, you can, if you can come to acceptance, maybe it's a song that can be a celebration. But I realized I knew that Leonard Cohen was a Buddhist, and maybe even a Buddhist monk or something, but I studied deeply in Buddhism. But it hadn't struck me how incredibly reflective that song was of the Buddhist tradition until I heard that story, and I started thinking about this person's story as it related to loss and just and then there's the irony too, of course, that I had been listening to that song all the way up on the drive, and here the song was so important to him and his story and his life. Anyway, I never forgot that, and as soon as I got back to the States, I told my friend Mark Humphreys this story, and he said that he knew how to play it, and so he showed me how to play it on the guitar, and I've been playing it ever since. But so the story goes, and after I heard the story, I was like, okay, it's time to open the scotch. And so he agreed, and so we didn't eat dinner, and we drank the scotch and started playing songs and swapping songs. And I got pretty drunk because I hadn't eaten anything, and we shared a whole bottle of scotch, and he got pretty drunk too. And he asked me if I wanted to see the cave, and I was like, yeah, of course I want to see the cave. So we walked down, and we walked through the train tracks, and we walked through it was awesome. But there was like a tunnel bridge and everything. We walked through that, and we walked down to the beach, and we went in this cave, and he was just telling stories one after another about different things and different aspects of his life. And then I laid down in the cave, and I woke up. I fell asleep, and I woke up, I don't know, it was an hour later or 2 hours later, and I'm looking out of the cave, and I can see the ocean, and I had to remind myself where I was because I was somewhat drunk, and I walked out of the cave, and he was just standing there looking at the ocean, and I don't know how long it had been, but it was a crazy night, and we went back up, and we finally ate dinner. It must have been about 3:30 or 4 in the morning, and we had dinner, and then we played some more songs, and we went into his little cabin, and we fell asleep. His cabin was 6 feet wide and 8 feet long, and barely enough room for 2 men to lay down. And here's a view from the front porch of his cabin. I don't know how well you can see it, but I'm going to turn this light off. Okay, can you see that? And you can see the ocean right there. So that's the view from his cabin. And here's a picture of his front door. I actually have a picture of him somewhere, but I can't find it. I looked long and hard for it today. Here's a picture of Clarky. That's Clarky that I described earlier in the story. And that's his wife, whose name I don't recall. Sorry about that. And And here is a picture of his front door. You can see he's taken bones and made some kind of, there's a skull in there also. But can you see that? But that's the cabin. You can see the inside. It's kind of got a peaked roof. And it's not very big. I can tell you, my feet would touch one side or my head would touch the other when I was laying there. I'm not even 6 feet tall. So it was not very big. And I woke up at sunrise, about 6 o'clock, I think it was, and got in my car and drove away. And he was still asleep, of course. But that was my trip to New Zealand in 2002. It was one of the most devastatingly sad stories I'd ever heard, and I was flattered that he imparted it on me. I wanted to go back and visit him again over the years, but I've never had a chance to get back to New Zealand. So maybe if I ever get back there, I'll see if he's still hanging out there in the cabin. But I don't know. I have no idea. I have a friend named Tarina, and many of you, if some of you will know that name, Tarina and I have been friends for more than 20 years, and she's from New Zealand, and she recently moved to Oamaru. I invited her to watch this podcast or this episode, but I don't know if she ever joined. I never saw her say anything. Are you there, Tarina? Anyway, Tarina lives in Oamaru, and she met Clarky, and Clarky said that he remembered me. Glad to know. So I'll play the song for you, and then I'll be done. Let me know if you like this episode, story time. Tomorrow, my guest will be Cosmic Charlie from, his most recent band is Chicago Farmer and the Field Notes, but he's also in Bones Jugs. He used to be Bones Jugs and Harmony, and he plays with a lot of people. He's a great upright bass player, and he does a lot of things well, but he also, I think, helps run the Rose Bowl Tavern in Urbana, Illinois. And he and I are going to talk about music and the state of things and what it's like to be in Chicago Farmers Band. But then Thursday from Canada, we have Mike Lynch going to be on the show. Very excited about that. I listened to Mike's new record yesterday, and it reminds me a lot of like Chris Knight with the full band. Really great record, and I can't wait to talk to him about that. Then on Friday, I have I would call her a local talent, although she's not had most of her career here. She just moved to Effingham some 6 months ago or so. Her name is Danny Flowers, and she's a great songwriter and singer. We're lucky to have her in our community. So tune in Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. I don't have a schedule for next week yet, but we'll see. But if you like these stories, then maybe I'll do one a week where I do a story time. This is the song Hallelujah by Leonard Cohen, as I heard it by what is his name? Jeff Buckley. Well, I would say my favorite version of the song is actually by Rufus Wainwright, and really the live version on his 2 CD DVD set is devastating. They say there was a secret chord that David played and it pleased the Lord, but you don't really go for music, do you? It goes like this: the fourth, the fifth, the minor fall, the major lift. It says it right there. The fourth, the fifth, the minor fall, the major lift. The baffled king composing hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Your faith was strong, but you needed proof. You saw her bathing on a roof. Her beauty in the moonlight overthrew you. She tied you to her kitchen chair. She crushed your throne and cut your hair. And from your lips she drew the hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Your faith was strong, which, no, I had that one already. Okay, so I'm going to sing all 7 verses that Peter Patton recited to me that day, if I can remember them. You said I took the name in vain, but I don't even know the name. But even if I did, well, what's it to you? There's a blaze of light in every word. It doesn't matter which you heard, the holy or the broken. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Well, I did my best, it wasn't much, I couldn't feel, so I learned to touch, and I tell the truth, I didn't come to fool you. Even though it all went wrong, I stand before the Lord a song with nothing on my lips but hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Well, baby, I've been here before. I know this room, I've walked this floor. I used to live alone before I knew you. And I saw your flag on the marble arch, but love is not a victory march. It's a cold and a very lonely hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Well, there was a time when you let me know what was really going on below, but now you never show that to me, do ya? I remember how I moved in you, and the Holy Dove was moving too, and every breath we drew was hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. It's no complaint, maybe there's a God above, but all I ever learned of love was how to shoot at someone who outdrew you. It's no complaint you hear tonight, I'm not a pilgrim who's seen the light. It's just a cold and a very broken hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. All right, folks, that has been the tale of Peter Patton, the hermit from New Zealand, and the song Hallelujah by Leonard Cohen. Thank you so much for tuning in. And you know, as always, we'll see you tomorrow. Well, I mean, not always, but during the week, we'll always see you tomorrow, 3 o'clock. Been a pleasure talking to you.